So where we left off Friday was talking about context. So what's actually going on in regards to this conflict, like what specifically, but then also what's going on in the rest of the world that is maybe exacerbating it or making it seem less than it actually is. So there are a number of influences on conflict management and how we actually, as individuals, deal with conflict. So you have your cultural values, your family influences that affect how you do it. You have the two different approaches, you have the different conflict styles, you have how your gender, ethnicity, can influence your conflict style, and then you also have how your religion can influence your conflict management. So our cultural values influences how we feel about conflict. And a lot of it depends on how we view face. So we as Americans, we don't have a huge concept of face. Yeah, we have our ego, but we're not like China or Japan, where we put a lot of effort into saving and giving face. But some things for you guys to think about how you view conflict. Do you think conflict is good or bad? Let me actually ask. Okay, so I just need like a random way to do this. Tirza, okay, do you think conflict is good or bad? Okay, well, Amy says she thinks it's bad. Bryn, what about you? Do you think conflict is good or bad? Gonna have a lot of people absent for attendance today when they're not responding.
I think that conflict could be good or bad. Bad if it's excessive, but I think it could be good in the case of like solving, like communicating and solving problems between two people or whatever.
Yeah, and Demi says can be good, question mark. What about you, Johan? What do you think?
I don't know. There's not very much context to that. Like, it's part of life. I don't know, like good or bad. And it depends. Needs more context, I guess.
Yeah, and you guys are pretty much all right. You know, it needs more context, and it can be good and it can be bad. So obviously, if you and your significant other are having a physical conflict, then that's probably bad conflict, right? But if you and one of your friends are having a discussion on how best to go about a certain course of action, that could be good, it could be productive, you guys could be working toward an answer together. So yes, the context definitely can affect it if it's good or bad. So basically the answer is it depends. Yeah, so Amber says it can be good if you solve it the right way and if you approach it the right way, but it can be bad if it arises, so if it becomes too much. So, but one of the good things about conflict is 99% of the time you can literally just walk away. And sometimes you need to just walk away sometime. And then, you know, what's the best way to handle conflict? So Brent, what do you think is the best way to handle conflict?
With a good attitude and seeing everything from other people's viewpoints, not just your own.
Yeah, I think that first part that you said is probably the most important one, is having a good attitude about it, because you kind of cut out a little bit, but I think that's what you said. But having a good attitude about it, like most of the time, even if you are in a conflict situation, the people or the other person or the other party is most likely not out to get you. they're not seeing themselves as the bad guy. You know, they're not this supreme evil being. They're just another person with another viewpoint that may or may not be correct. You know, it'll depend. But, you know, if you go into it with a positive viewpoint and an open mind, and assuming that, you know, they are not just out to be mean or rude, and assuming better intentions, then you're going to handle that conflict better. Obviously, this does not always apply if you are in a situation where you are physically unsafe. If you are in a situation where you are physically unsafe, then you might not be able to handle that with the, oh, everything's going to be fine, or these people, you know, are good people, because unfortunately, like, that's does not always happen that way. But if you're just in like general conflict where you have a disagreement, then if you go into it with, you know, a more positive attitude and more positive assumptions, with the expectation that you are going to solve it, then most of the time it should end out okay. But if you are in a physically unsafe situation, that is just try to extricate yourself from that situation if possible. So how do we think that we learn our conflict management skills? Josie. Okay. Melissa, where do you think we learn how to handle conflict?
I think that like we learn a lot by experience. Like it's probably something that doesn't come super naturally to most people. It's just like, you know, your instinct isn't to just be super calm. So I think just practice, like really focus on being calm about it and, you know, like thinking things through before you say something.
Yeah, our instinct is definitely not to remain calm, because I'm sure you've all seen a 3-year-old told no, right? It's like the end of the world. So yeah, we learn by experience, and we learn by seeing other people deal with conflict, particularly those who are close to us, to our friends and our family. So if we were raised with our parents, then we probably handle conflict in a similar way to how they did. Because we do what we know, even if it's maybe not the healthiest of mechanisms to do so. Or if we spend a lot of time around our grandparents or our friends or adopted family, we probably act in a similar way that they do in regards to how we handle conflict, because that's just what we're exposed to. So we are taught by our family, but we're also taught by the media to an extent as well. Because I'm sure you guys have all seen like some really terrible rom-coms where you're just like, they could literally solve this problem by sitting down at the table and just asking each other, right? Just sitting down and literally talking about it. But they never do, because that's not what sells movies. But then sometimes we can see that in our own life, and you're like, oh my gosh, this is just like that thing where they could literally just solve this by sitting and talking. So, but our family also influences how we deal with conflict. Like I said, most of us deal with it in the same way that we learned growing up. So if one of our parents really avoided conflict and we identified more with that parent, then maybe we tend to try to avoid conflict as well. So if our parents had a super healthy relationship and good coping mechanisms in regards to conflict management, then we probably do as well. If they did not, or the people we were raised around didn't, we might not have the healthiest conflict management. And our strategies that we use to manage and resolve conflict tends to relate to how we manage our relationships and our self-image. So are you trying to preserve your self-image? Are you trying to preserve your ego? Or are you one of the ones who is willing to sacrifice that and, kind of back off? So in general, women tend to be more accommodating, at least from what I have seen. And when I've asked the question in class, women tend to identify more with the accommodators who tend to sacrifice their self-image in order to keep peace and maintain relational harmony. So there are different ways to approach conflict, which lead us to those 4 different styles where we saw that infographic of this one. Woohoo! Indirect and direct, and then restrained or expressive. So if you are a person who takes a direct approach, so you're thinking more of that conflict is more fundamentally good or productive. And, when it happens, approach it head on. Let's get it out of the way. And let's talk about it. Let's find a solution and, and let's build upon this. And then indirect tends to be more pacifistic, thinking that conflict should be avoided and that it's not productive. And they don't tend to want to push further away, even if they may think that they are correct. And then expressive, so very emotional, kind of wear their heart on their sleeve, and then more restrained, more calm, putting their emotions on the back burner. And, there's more of an ideal way to deal with things, but there really is no right or wrong way because everyone is different. Everyone deals with this differently. We probably should not be dealing with, most conflicts in a physical way, because we're adults. We should be able to use our words 90% of the time. But, everyone has their own style because of how they were raised, what their culture says they should do, what gender norms say they should do. Because, our gender norms say that, women should be more pacifistic, they should avoid conflict. And, women are so emotional and blah, 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 blah. So that's how society might tell us how women should behave, but obviously that's not all true. Melissa and Amber and Amy and Ashlyn, they don't all deal with conflict the same way. They're not all indirect, but emotionally expressive. Or they're not all direct and restrained or direct but expressive. So those 4 styles where they tend, where the intersections are discussion, engagement, accommodation, and dynamic. So discussion is direct and also emotionally restrained. So if you are a white European American, you probably tend to use more discussion style. So say what you mean, let's talk this out, let's get it done, but let's not involve too much emotion in it, because we want to still have our rational minds. Engagement, so very direct, but maybe slightly more confrontational or slightly more emotional. So allowing that kind of emotion to come through so your conversation partners can actually see how you're feeling. It's like, no, this has affected me and I want you to know. So African Americans, more Southern Europeans. Accommodating, so you are emotionally restrained and also indirect. So tend to just kind of, maybe step back, let it happen, might not speak up. So Asian cultures, American natives, Latin American cultures. And then dynamic, so indirect, but also emotionally expressive. So maybe pacifistic to an extent, but also very much letting you know. So some people might call that passive aggressive. So, but do those make sense? And can you guys kind of see where you might follow along on there? You know, everyone is different. You know, not everyone in this class who is a white American is going to be, you know, more discussion and more direct and restrained. Not everyone who is an African American is going to be, you know, more engagement style. Not everyone who is Native American is going to be more accommodating, because it does, you know, you all have your own personal quirks and your personal, you know, ways of doing things and your own personalities. So this is once again just more of a generalization about typically preferred by XYZ group of people. So Peyton, which one of these four do you think you would be?
Probably engagement.
Okay, thank you. Sabrina, what about you?
I was thinking engagement style too.
Cool. Kyler, what about you? Amber, which one do you think you'd be?
I think it depends on like the situation, either discussion or engagement. If I want like someone to like see how it affected me, probably more engagement.
So, I mean, I guess we've only talked to 3 people, but if you notice, everyone chose one of the ones that was more direct. So, woohoo! Americans, we do tend to be very direct, just in general. So, thank you guys. But not only, you know, our culture and our race and ethnicity and the family that we're raised in affects how we view conflict, but also our gender can influence how we handle conflict. So women tend to be more accommodating in general. Not all women, as we said, we just had 3 women in here who said they were engagement and discussion. And men tend to use more of an engagement style. So we do behave in some of those stereotypical ways in some contexts, but not all, hence why we do have stereotypes. But, you know, I'm going to be honest, like if I'm facing conflict and there is some man standing there across from me yelling in my face, I'm going to be very accommodating, just because there is a physical strength difference there and I don't want to get in a fight that I can't win. But, you know, if I'm just discussing someone with someone, I'm probably not going to be as accommodating, just because my personality it's very much more direct and tends to be, I don't know, I guess it depends if I'm more emotional or more not, depending on the context, like some people have said. So it just depends on the situation we're in, but sometimes we do behave in stereotypical ways. And then in regards to religion and conflict, religious views have caused a lot of conflict over the past, well, let's be honest, like 5,000 years, with the, you know, millions of religions we've had in all of human history. But people hold these views very, very strongly. So if they feel like those views are being disparaged or attacked, then it can cause people to feel upset and therefore cause conflict. So, and the conflict might be actual religious conflict about people arguing over who's right and who's wrong. Or it can, be just based on value differences about, hey, we might believe in the same religion, but you're acting wrong, or, this particular value you have is twisted when it should be this. But it definitely does cause conflict. We see religious conflict, throughout history and even into modern times. We talked about pop culture, was it last week or the week before? And while US media itself is pretty secular, the countries that it gets sent over to are not always. So when we talked about like American music videos, or American music or movies, they're not always very welcomed over in the Middle East because of that religious difference. American society as a whole is very secular. Countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, they are not as much. So if the US is trying to sell their secular media over there, that can be a cause of religious conflict or religious tension. Or if you have people who think that there's only one right way to do thing, and they think everyone else should behave that way, then that would cause conflict because, people don't really like to be told what to do, right? So if someone was an Orthodox Christian and said, okay, well, all of you women have to wear your head coverings, or an Orthodox Jew and said, none of us can eat bacon, or someone who's Muslim and said, none of us can eat pork, or someone who's Christian and said, none of you guys can eat shellfish or shrimp or wear mixed fabrics, that would cause conflict because people are going to be like, you can't tell me what to do. So how do we actually manage all of this potential for conflict, right? There's just in life in general, there's the potential for conflict in everything. I could say, Johan, I think your cat is funny looking. And that could cause conflict, even though Johan, that cat is adorable. But that could have caused a conflict. How do I know how Johan's going to react to that? He might be like, okay, I'm going to go beat up Miss Becker in the parking lot later. Or if I say, the Broncos sucks and the Chiefs are better, who knows how people are going to react to that. But conflict is not always destructive, even though there's the potential for it. And it doesn't always have to be competitive either. So when we're in conflict, in regards to anything, most of us see interpersonal conflict where, in relationships with our family, we're having issues. We want to try to make it productive. So if we're having productive conflict, we want to identify. Sorry, Kyler, I'm going to mute you. I was getting some feedback. In productive conflict, you want to identify the very specific problem that you are having. So you're not bringing up something in the past that happened. We're saying, okay, this is our issue right now. So the problem is that my roommate keeps leaving the dishes in the sink and not rinsing them or anything. Okay, so we're just going to focus on that problem. We're not going to make other generalizations or have the negative attitude of like, oh, you never do any housework, or, you're such a piece of crap for blah, blah, blah. Or, you just like to see me mad, so that's why you never do the dishes. We're not going to do that. We're going to say, okay, the problem is the dishes have been sitting in the sink, unrinsed, unwashed for a week, and it is the roommate's turn to do dishes. We're going to focus on the original issue. So what is the original issue? Well, the pretty much the only issue is the dishes are not getting done. But what is the base of that issue? Why aren't the dishes getting done? So are the dishes not getting done because the roommate has been working 12-hour shifts every day at the hospital? Or because, you know, maybe they've fallen into, you know, a depressive funk and just can't pull themselves out and they haven't even been showering? Or is it something like, okay, the dishes aren't done because my roommate has been sitting in their bedroom playing video games for 16 hours a day? So what is the base of that issue and what's causing it? And then we're going to direct the discussion toward cooperation and cooperative problem solving. So it's like, hey, roommate, I have noticed that the dishes have been in the sink for a while. Is there anything going on in your life right now? Like, how are you doing? And just trying to say, okay, well, let's find out what's wrong, and then how are we going to solve this? It's like, do you need, you know, if you're in kind of a funk right now, do you need help around the house and getting some of your chores done? Like, I'm happy to help you, I just need to know. Rather than, oh, if you don't get the dishes done, then XYZ is going to happen. So try to be cooperative and solve the problem. And sometimes that, you know, that does mean working together and sacrificing a little bit on both sides and saying, okay, well, those dishes are nasty, but, you know, my roommate's sick or they're not feeling good. So I do need to help them out, because that's what a good person would do, even if it means pulling on those gloves and bleach watering that entire sink. So we're saying, hey, I've noticed you've been in your room a lot, playing a lot of video games. Do you need my help doing the dishes? One thing that's really good to remember, that if I were you and you happen to be taking notes, that I would write down just for future reference, is when you are talking to people and you are having a conflict, you should be using I language. I feel this way. You do not want to be using you language, because that's very accusatory. So let's say that, who wants to be my roommate? Let's say Ramon is my roommate. I'm going to say, I feel this way. I feel like you have been neglecting your part of the chores because because the dishes aren't done. Or I feel maybe something might be a little wrong because it seems like you haven't got your part of the household chores done, rather than, you know, you haven't gotten your stuff done. Like, what are you doing? Because the you language is a lot more accusatory, or at least it sounds that way to people. So focus on how it's made you feel, or your interpretation. Because if I say, you know, hey, I'm a little worried for you because this hasn't got done, rather than you haven't done the dishes, you know, Ramon is going to be more open to responding and saying, yeah, I'm sorry, I haven't gotten that done. I've just been, you know, I've just been unmotivated to do it, or I haven't felt good, or insert whatever here, rather than just like, well, you know, well, yeah, I haven't done the dishes, so what? Just because people tend to be put on the defensive when you start using you language rather than I language. So for future reference. And then in productive conflict, you want to lead and behave in a way that will help you lead to a mutually satisfactory outcome. And just because it's mutually satisfactory doesn't mean that both parties don't give something up, because, you know, sometimes you do have to accommodate a little bit or give something up in order to solve the problem. Both parties do, or both parties might have to. But then in destructive conflict, it gets very polarized. More of the my way or the highway. You know, if you don't do these dishes, then I'm just going to kick you out of the house. That's probably not very productive to getting the stuff done and to getting the problem solved. But yeah, in destructive conflict, it tends to be more competitive escalation rather than cooperative, de-escalation or cooperative teamwork. So, and then competitive versus cooperative conflict. So how can we promote cooperative communication? It's hard because if we're in conflict, our emotions might be running a little high. But there are some ways around that. Sometimes we just have to put the issue on hold and say, look, I'm sorry, I can't talk about this right now. And that is totally fine. You can always tell someone, hey, I'm getting a little too emotional here. I'm getting a little too invested. I feel like I'm going to say something I might regret later. So can we please put this issue on hold and come back to it in a little bit? Or, can I have a 5-minute break to think about what we've just talked about? Having both parties explore other options. So are there other ways to solve this rather than the two that the parties have presented? What are other people doing? What are other people thinking? Or you can delegate the issue to someone else and say, okay, do we need a mediator here? Do we need a neutral third party to come in and help us make a decision? And then if everyone who's in conflict, all the parties, are actually committed to solving a problem, then people feel ownership for that and are likely to see it through and actually, come to a solution. I thought there's only 23 slides. But one thing to remember about this, especially in like the internet age, is that trolls do exist. There are people out there who are just causing conflict for fun. And unfortunately, there's no way to win with that. So one way to figure out if your conflict does have a potential for resolution is to just say, okay, what is our goal here? What is our goal of this conversation? If people say, well, I don't know, then there's really no way to solve that because you have no goal to work towards. Or if they're just like, no, I'm just, messing around or whatever, okay, no way to really solve that. So what is their goal? Okay, a specific goal, is it achievable? Great, we can work towards that. Do they not have a goal, or is the goal literally just not feasible? Might not even be worth engaging with them then. You can always disengage with verbal conflict. So just going to be specific about the verbal. Physical conflict is different. So I only have a couple more minutes, so I'm just trying to think if there's anything I want to touch on before we wrap up. I guess we can just wrap it up because the other stuff is to an extent more on the global scale. I mean, I guess peace building and forgiveness are to an extent interpersonal problems too. But just to wrap everything up, conflict is a very natural everyday part of life. It does not have to be destructive, but it can be. So when you are in a situation with conflict, just try to stay centered, try to stay focused, and try not to polarize the issue into us versus them, because there are more factors to it than that. Maintain contact. So try to maintain contact so you can solve the issue. Recognize that people solve conflict in different ways. So just because you might do it one way does not mean that everyone does. And there's different ways for different situations that work better. And, different styles work best for different people. Recognize that the context of the conflict is important. I think you guys, based on what you said, really got that down. because you're talking about, well, is it productive or destructive? Is it good or bad? Well, it depends on the context. And be willing to forgive even if you don't forget. So with that forgiveness stuff, so let go of that feeling of revenge. You don't have to get back at people who have wronged you. You don't have to. You can just let it go. But you have to acknowledge that your feelings were hurt or that you have hurt someone else. And that someone else is angry at you or that you're angry at someone else, and that there is a need for, you to apologize or a need for you to heal. So I'm going to wrap it up there, and I'm going to take attendance real fast, so please do not run away.